Okay, good afternoon everyone. Can I now welcome everyone to the 6th meeting of 2010 of the Scottish Parliament Public Petitions Committee. We have one definite apology at the moment for John Farquhar-Munro for still with an illness. We've not heard from another member yet, but we'll see. A few minutes later. Okay, fair. Okay. Can I indicate to all members of the public in the public gallery and to all other members that all mobile phones and any other electronic devices should be switched off in case they interfere with the broadcasting system. And we now move to item 1 on our agenda, which is consideration of new petitions. Could I say to all elected members that there are additional papers for each of the new and current petitions we have in front of us this afternoon, and we will deal with those when we deal with each petition in turn. And our first petition this afternoon is petition 1319, and it's by Scott Robertson and William Smith, calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Government to investigate the legal status and appropriateness of professional SFA clubs entering into contracts with children under 16 years. 2, the audit process and accountability of all public funds distributed by the SFA to its member clubs. 3, the social, educational and psychological effects and legality of SFA member clubs prohibiting such children from participating in extracurricular activity, and the appropriateness of compensation payments under the SFA clubs for the transfer of young players under the age of 16. And the final 2 is to increase the educational target from 2 hours curriculum physical activity to 4 hours per week, and to develop a long-term plan to provide quality artificial surfaces for training and playing football at all ages across all regions in Scotland. We've got additional information. We are aware that some of these issues are part of the ongoing review that's due to be published shortly by the SFA, and they're also part of the continuing discussion that member clubs have with the SFA. So can I welcome both Scott and William, is it okay to call you your Sunday name? Yeah. Today? Okay, thanks very much, to the meeting today. And I also know there's a number of expressed interest by elected members, so I welcome the 3 members of the Scottish Parliament who are here to indicate their broad support for the petition. So I can maybe invite the opening comments from either yourself, William, or Scott. Okay, Scott.
Good afternoon, Chairman and committee members. Stephen Whittaker, Colin Nish, Kevin Thompson, Andy Driver, Kenny Miller, John Collins, Alan McGregor, Darren Fletcher. These are all local footballers who are national successes in our game. I would ask the committee today, does anyone know of a player who has successfully come through the Youth Initiative programme? Willie and I formed the Realgrassroots, and we launched our petition on the 27th of January. We also opened a website, and since that date in January we've had just under 6,000 visitors from all over Scotland, and we've recorded 170 surveys that contain 20 questions. I just want to give you 2 or 3 stats. 92% of those that replied said that young children should have the right to choose whether they play for their school or not. 82.6% said the Youth Initiative programme was not producing talented young players in this country. And 93% of those that replied said that funds from the government, from the public purse, should be channelled into the juvenile boys club or schools football, and not given to the SFA or to professional clubs. Andy Roxburgh once famously said, recreational football sits at the very bottom of the football pyramid, and without it, the whole pyramid collapses. We want to redress the balance between the professional clubs and the real grassroots game in Scotland. Willie.
Mr Chairman, William Smith, 45 years in the voluntary sector. The petition provides, in our opinion, sufficient grounds of concern, particularly in relation to children's welfare oblique rights, to ask this committee to recommend to the Scottish Parliament that with immediate effect all future funding given directly or indirectly to the Scottish Football Association or its member clubs should be frozen until Parliament itself has been satisfied that it is receiving value for its money, and it is not in any way being used to the detriment of children's legal rights or social well-being. Given the downward spiral of our national game at grassroots, club, European and international level, The objectives set out almost 14 years ago, when the Professional Youth Initiative was established, have clearly not been met, and given this, it seems to us that the benefactors of this funding have failed in their obligation to the taxpayer. The football authorities, in their arrogance, expect the taxpayer to continue to pour millions of pounds into these private businesses, without the SFA conceding that the taxpayer is entitled to expect positive results and that independent assessment procedures should be in place for that purpose. The Professional Youth Initiative is so out of control that children's rights are of little or no concern. For example, should we not be concerned about children's safety and welfare when clubs are taking young children as far as Inverness and Aberdeen on return journeys on a Sunday just to play a non-competitive game of football? What implications are there for the child in terms of exhaustion and stress in this situation? The petition will further highlight many more serious abuses of children's rights under the law in terms of the contractual or registration procedures currently used by the SFA and its member clubs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I know that there's a number of elected members have come into the committee today, maybe to indicate their comments or views on this. Can maybe invite one of those members to open comments? Okay, Kenny.
By one of these strange quirks of fate, we're obviously meeting today, convener, with the spectre of the resignation of the Chief Executive of the SFA hanging over us. I have to say I'd like to pay tribute to Gordon Smith, and I was indeed having a cup of coffee with two members of the SFA earlier on in the day. I think we have to remember that there is a football family and that we are actually all on the same side, whether in the SFA, SPL, SFL, youths, women. What we have to do is have some mutual respect and understanding. And as I say, I pay tribute to Gordon Smith and also wish his successor, whoever he or she may be, all the best. But I'd like to echo what Scott and Willie have been saying, which is that I think the future success of Scottish football has to be bottom-up and not top-down. The importance and the role of the Chief Executive is vital to Scottish football, but the success of Scottish football, of turning round what has been a steady decline over many years, will be bottom-up. And the real praise there has to go to Scott and Willie. I know Scott personally for the hours that he puts in Musselburgh and elsewhere. He and Willie are just one of many who, throughout their length and breadth of this country, and everybody in their own constituency will know numerous teams and clubs, they give their time. It costs them a lot of money because there's no remuneration in it. They put in their heart and soul. They do it, as I say, with little, as I say, gratitude often given, and I think we should recognise as a Parliament just how important it is. It's not simply the possibility for people to go on and be successful footballers and internationals, that amongst whom Scott narrated there, but the benefit it does in keeping kids out of trouble, making them healthier, keeping them on the straight and narrow. And therefore, as I say, we owe a debt of gratitude to the real grassroots in football. I think the reason I support this matter is that we recognise that there is a problem in Scotland. We do have difficulties here. Some of these difficulties have come about for correct reasons. We had to bring in Disclosure Scotland. That did have an impact. It wasn't cost-free in terms of either the financial matter or indeed the problems it caused for schools and boys' clubs, but everybody recognises that we do have to have it. Equally, we all recognise that facilities, and that was the purpose of my discussion with the SFA in Scotland today, are frankly inadequate, not fit for purpose, and in some extent shambolic, and we have to change that. It's not going to be quick and it's not going to be easy because we didn't get into this overnight and we won't get out of it overnight. But the reason I support Scott and Willie, and no doubt it's shared by colleagues here, is it's a direction of travel. There is a template being set which says that we recognise that we have to draw a line in the sand, that we do have to make sure that we invest in the game of football. It's part of Scotland's psyche and soul. Equally, we have to make sure that, as well as appointing a new chief executive, that we do make sure that we build from the bottom up, that we support the grassroots game, not simply on the basis that it's from the grassroots game that the success of the national team will be built, but in terms of the community spirit, the citizenship and all these matters. And as I say, not everything can be delivered. There's financial constraints. The desire for a Tory Glen to be replicated is something that we aspire to. But in the current financial climate, it's hard to see that. But as I say, I certainly give my full support to the real grassroots in the direction of travel.
so much. I know that Trish has raised this matter with the SFA in the past, so maybe
I just want to say a few words, Convener. I mean, football, when you're a young guy, you should enjoy it. I mean, I know they all want to be David Beckham or, dare I say, a Henrik Larsson, and maybe their parents want that as well. But they should be enjoying their football. They should be able to play in the kind of team that Willie and Scott have, or they should be able to play for their school football. And I'm concerned of two things. One, the contract under which some of these boys have been put and the way that they are moved about. It seems to me that is manifestly wrong, and it cuts them off from not only playing football for the school, but also the involvement that means and the spin-offs in that in terms of their interaction with other kids in the school. But every bit as importantly is the fact that the government are giving money, and it is very difficult to get an audit trail of that money. Indeed, I'm awaiting an answer from the Minister at this moment about where the money has actually gone. And I do question children's rights under the law when they're being asked to sign contracts which are for very young children as young as 10 or 11. I'm not sure that in actual fact is the law, and if it is, perhaps it's something that we should look at. And what Willie said at the beginning is absolutely right. The only talent we're going to get is from the bottom up. And if we look back a few years back at the footballers that were playing for Scotland when it was actually an honour to play for Scotland, although it doesn't seem to be now, then a lot of them were signed on S forms. S forms I can understand that they're playing for their school, they're signed in an S form, they're given a bit of tuition and help from a club, but they still continue to play for their school, and they're watched and eventually brought into the system, the club. That for me was a much more visible and easier way of doing things. So I do have some concerns, not some, I have deep concerns about the issues that both Scott and Willie have raised, and I hope that today the Petitions Committee will be able to support what they are asking for. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Convener. I suppose I would just like to highlight two particular issues of concern. One is that the contracts that have been signed appear to allow clubs to restrict the extent to which people under the age of 16 or indeed 17 or 18-year-olds can actually move to play for a different team if that actually suits them. I mean, it does seem to me that the best judge of whether a young player is actually enjoying his or her football is actually that young person themselves, and secondly, perhaps their parents or people who actually have their best interests at heart. And it does seem to me that the mechanisms of these contracts, which actually prevent children moving on for playing reasons, for social reasons, or for other reasons, are not actually in the best interest of that child. And I suppose the second issue is the idea that underpins that, which is children being seen as assets belonging to a particular club, and to some extent having a price on their head. So that they can move, but only provided a bigger club is prepared to pay off the initial club in order to free up the contract. Now, I can understand that in some highly specialised cases, perhaps the Wayne Rooneys or the very special players. But I think the extent to which this is happening to young people is something that is not in the interests of these young people or in the interests of football more generally. I think Scott made the point, how many players are coming through the youth scheme, and is that in the best interests of Scottish football? I think that's one consideration, but I think the most important consideration is actually about the human rights of the child in these circumstances. Children should not be seen as chattels or assets of any organisation. Least of all, I think a football club to be bought and sold in terms of their services at the age of 16 or less. So I think the system that exists doesn't have appropriate safeguards. I think the principles of it are very much open to question. Its impact on individual children is not something that would be tolerable in any other context. I mean, if we take the word football out of this and said, transpose it into another sport or another activity or another area of life, would we actually allow rights to be signed away in this kind of way? I think it only requires a moment's consideration to say that wouldn't be allowed. So I don't think football can be a special case. I do think we actually have to pay particular attention to the rights of the child in this instance, and make sure that young people as minors are not entering into contracts, perhaps without appropriate legal advice, or contracts of any kind that fetter them as assets of football teams. And I think that's something we need to change. Thank you, Convener.
Maybe invite comments from members of the committee. I think Nigel, and then Bill, and then Robin. Okay.
Thank you, Convener. First of all, I think what I've taken out of what's been said so far is that there are really two issues. One is, if it might put it simply like this, the human rights of the children involved. But secondly, I think, gentlemen, that you were talking about the amount of money that's going into football and where it's going. And not because I think it's the most important issue, but actually because it's the one I'd like some clarity on. I'm wondering if I could just ask you, please, to confirm the sums of money that are involved. And I can give you a clue in the sense that the data in front of me, which has been kindly provided by Spice, suggests that something like £1.5 million current would be the money that's going to the SFA for the youth development side, and something like £1.5 million in a year seems to be the cash back for communities, and I'm looking to some extent at the Minister for some confirmation. Are those the right order of magnitude numbers, please? And are there other items of... Are there other sums of money involved? I'm just trying to get the scale of it. I'm not worried about the last 100,000.
Yeah, I think there was a parliamentary question that we submitted previously, and over the last 3 years the sums of money channelled either directly to the SFA or indirectly, and by that I mean through Sports Scotland and then or the Football Partnership, totalled, it was just over about £12.5 million in the last 3 seasons.
So that's £4 million a year, which is marginally more than I've just discussed. Does that include cash back for communities? We think it does.
I believe it did.
Yeah, okay. So it's something like £4 million a year is the sum of money we're talking about. Right, thank you. I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you, Convener. I think that gets us started.
Bill, and then Robin.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Just ask a couple of questions, if I may. I think it was Mr Robertson who said that the Scottish Youth Football Initiative is a failure. Could you tell me, in your view, why it fails? What are the main reasons it is not successful? And if you had your way, how would you turn that around?
There's a couple of things, and I'll keep them brief. The magnitude of the system, for one. This was a system put in place for the elite players in Scottish football. This season we have 139 teams operating in the Youth Initiative system. Now, if every team registers its capacity of 20 players, that will give us 2,780 young players. Do we really have 2,780 elite players in Scotland? And if I break that down a little bit, if we take one of the Edinburgh-based clubs, they have 120 players in their Youth Initiative system, and you've got to ask how much, if those are elite players, how much time can we dedicate? If they say only had 40 players, surely they could focus and really start to talent identify. What we seem to be doing is harvesting young kids and putting as many as possible through the system to try and find that one gem.
You want to add something
Yes,
to
if
that?
you don't mind, I would put it to you this way. Some time ago, this proud nation produced players for Manchester United, for Arsenal, for Liverpool, for the great English clubs. And we needed that money, or clubs needed that transfer money at that time, 20, 30 years ago, to even survive then. Now we are producing clubs, players of a quality for no more than the Championship in England. That in itself reflects the failure of the pro-youth initiative. We don't even, that I'm aware of, have a top English club with a scout in Scotland anymore. says it all.
I take your point. I mean, I can remember when even the team that I support, Partick Thistle, produced Alec Forsyth for Manchester United and Alan Hansen for the BBC, before that Liverpool. So there were players across the board in the Premier League and the old First Division, so I take that point. Just one additional question. You identified what you see as the problem, the harvesting of players, too many kids being, or too many young people who are signed up to this and yet with no real prospect of progressing. How would you turn it round, or what would be the way to turn it round into success? Would you just scrap it and start again?
No,
what would you do?
No, I think you would have to look at that and analyse how you could actually deal with that. But the first objective, in my view, is to get the kids back playing in the environment, a natural development environment, playing with their friends in school football, playing with Hillwood Boys Club or Musselburgh Windsor at under 10, 11, 12s, 13s. We have a ridiculous situation here where one child has signed a form for an SPL football club for 4 years that is an illegal document. He is 8 and he's signed it. And what's even worse, members, is his parents signed it as well. And it isn't even recognised by the Scottish Football Association. But they are aware of this. It is not the first time. 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote to the SFA, and I have a copy of the letter, warning them about the use of a T for training form. All clubs were written to and told that they would be brought before the General Purposes Committee of the SFA if they were found to use this document. Sadly, in its current structures, the General Purposes Committee is made up of the very clubs and people who are committing this. So you can see from where we're coming from, it's like banging our head against a brick wall. But that child is 8, and he's not the only one. There are many signing contracts at 7, 8 years of age. This one I've got a copy of, the chairman should have a copy, is only 8, and he's signed a document for 4 years. So he thinks. That document is not recognised by the SFA, so technically speaking, he's been deceived.
Mr Robertson, you want to, through you, Chair, add something?
You asked what I would do, and I think there's a couple of things. For starters, scale back the numbers. We don't have nearly 3,000 elite young players in Scotland, if only. We can dream of that. So we need to scale back the numbers. Because what we're doing when we take these players in, whether they be 8 or they be 12 or 13, we're giving them a false sense that they are going to be a football player. And I've been in the school's football for 21, 22 years. And kids will say to the teacher at 12 or 13 in the first year at the school, but miss, it doesn't really matter what happened at the Battle of Hastings, or if that's the chemical formula for water, I'm going to be a football player. And it undermines, and head teachers will tell you this, it undermines what we're doing. An entirely different scenario in Holland. If you are not successful and attend and do your studies, there is no football. So I'm very keen, and I think Willie's the same, that we look after the child, and I mean the whole child. The clubs are only interested in that person as an asset, as a football commodity. We're saying that's wrong. We want to look at the child as a whole. To take a kid that's 9 and 10 and 11 out the natural environment, it's football, for goodness sake. We play it because we enjoy it. We want the love of the game. John Gold wrote back in 2004 about the dropout rate. It was 96% because of this system. And he wrote to one of the MSPs, let's leave the kids where they're enjoying their football, where they're having fun, they're building relationships with their friends. Why don't we get the clubs to come in and deliver the coaching locally? Why take one player from the east and one from the west and one from central, put a team and they come together once a week, they barely know each other's names? How is that getting and it's a precious situation we're putting the kids into. It's football. Let them enjoy the game.
Wise, thank you.
Robin?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I've listened to your presentation with interest and a great deal of concern for what we've heard. Scott Robertson, you said that it needs to be scaled back. I think my one observation would be is, would you agree that in fact some of these practices are so intolerable that scaling back is not all that needs to be done? What is actually, even if there were just 20 young people involved in this, there are things that are happening that should not happen to 20 brilliant young footballers, however much promise they showed.
Yes, I would agree with you, Mr Harper. We have effectively 31 academies in Scotland. We're a nation of 5.5 million. If we look over the water to Holland, now they have, I think, a population of 16 million, yet they only have 12 academies, whether it's Ajax or FC20. Why do we have so many? Can we really monitor all the poor practice that is going on with so many academies? We want to identify talent, yes. We want that talent to be successful for the national team, but not at the risk of some of the activities that the member raises, and certainly not to the detriment of the young kids and the thousands that are not going to make it as a football player.
Yes, I think what you're striving to do is entirely laudable. I too very much share your concerns about the possible impacts on young people who have to be at the centre of our concerns at that age. Clearly, these clubs are highly competitive businesses, and they're at pains to protect their investment. We can recognise that, but we think that we would agree that that runs contrary to the rights of individual children. Where in the world, I mean, who has got the best kind of system? I mean, one of the reasons we've got so many youth academies here is that they're based on individual club level. Now, I don't know how you kind of, in a sense, given the competitive nature of clubs, how you change that. But is there a model somewhere which protects the rights of young people whilst at the same time developing their potential and also creating the kind of players for the future? And, you know, what is that model, and how hard is it for us to begin to think about adopting it? What would the barriers be?
We spoke here several times about Holland, but Holland isn't the only country, but we'll focus in on Holland to try and give you an idea of the quality, the objectives of that club being shared objectives in their own interest and shared objectives in the interest of that child. Holland is the perfect example. We have a problem in this country where a child can sign a contract for 1 year, and that club has got a hold on that young player for a further 2 years. So if he concludes the contract that he signs, he can't leave if that club won't let him go. All we need to do is drop a recorded delivery letter to him at the start of the following season saying we're retaining you, and then the following year. Now, if you take it that that's a 15-year-old player, we're heading down the road to disaster if a young guy can't get released from a club. At 16, 17, he's heading for a perilous period in his life.
Is that the case in Holland? I mean, really,
no, that's a Scottish case, sorry.
Yeah.
The case in Holland is that if a player signs for a club for 3 years, that club has to commit itself to the player for 3 years. He's in a contract which is equal. In Scotland, the contract the club signs means nothing. The club can tear up his contract within a week, whether he likes it or whether he doesn't.
The same system happens south of the border. I mean, I went and visited various youth academies. I mean, for example, the youth academy at Liverpool Football Club has had a very good reputation over the years. I think produced players like Michael Owen. And is it the same down south as well?
To be fair, I'm not familiar with the English system. I don't know if you are, Scott. But I don't think it's that dissimilar to the one that operates in Scotland.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Just on the issue of the club signing these young people up, is there any money changing hands? Is there any payments being made by the clubs, or when the parents are signing off on these contracts, is there some form of financial retainer that's been awarded in relation to the signing of these forms?
No, there shouldn't be.
Because the convener, I think it's quite crucial. I understand there shouldn't be any money exchanges hands, but my understanding is in some cases money does
exchange hands to retain or get these forms to be signed. And the difficulty here is that we are talking about effectively getting into child labour laws, where we're actually talking about under 16s. And it is quite concerning when we do have major clubs in Scotland using a system effectively that would be equivalent to child labour and would be outlawed in relation to UK legislation, but seems to be a common practice. Would either Scott or William want to confirm that it is a common practice that clubs are, to your knowledge, using financial inducements to get young people to sign these documents?
We have heard of cases, but I have to say to you, we have no concrete evidence to back that up. What I would say to you is that I would be grateful if the committee would give consideration to the compensation payments that we do know about. The compensation payments that have been placed on children as young as 12 years of age. We have the case of one young lad in Dumbarton, Kieran Gibbons, who Hamilton Academicals will not release because nobody's willing to pay £9,000 for him. He's not kicked a ball since May. He's only 14. Now, what I would say to you in that as well is the fact that I believe that respected members of this Parliament wrote to the authorities and said to them, please don't raise that fee, £3,000 a year. They raised it to £5,000 a year, so it's £15,000 for a player in the similar circumstances now, and they dropped the age groups that it was applicable to. So we now have compensation fees. In my opinion, it doesn't matter whether you play for Rangers and sign for St Mirren or Inter Milan to Rangers or whatever. It's a transfer fee. Compensation is just a nice word. It's a transfer fee. And it's a scandal, and we have to stop it.
Convener, that raises a question about clubs putting a price on young people's heads in terms of being transferred over. And really in terms, as I said earlier, in terms of child labour laws, in terms of employment legislation, then in any other aspect that we have in society in the UK or in Scotland, no employer would be able to do that. And clearly there are issues here that we have to look at quite closely, because in terms of those under the age of 16, the employment legislation or the employment rights of those children under 16 actually rest with the local authorities. And in terms of the UK government employment legislation, it's the local authorities that are supposed to monitor, because it's the local authorities that give permission for young people to work under the age of 16. So there are quite clearly issues here that we need to look at, and I will be raising later on, Convener, the role of local authorities in this, because I think both the speakers have indicated that local authorities are clearly concerned about how those young people perceive their future career paths if they are being signed up at the age of 8, 9, 10, that they think they are going to go into football. But as you said, the rate of dropout, I think it was 96% was the figure that was being quoted, is a very substantial figure and could be effectively destroying a lot of young people's lives because they have expectations that are never going to be met. And
my colleague John Wilson raises is a very important one, and I say that mainly because I was going to raise it myself. But just to say that at one of our last committee meetings, we were in Fife at a school, and there were pupils who put forward a petition highlighting the child labour laws that were not being adhered to. So I think it is one that's worth looking into. The other question I was going to ask was, I understand that you had a meeting with Tam Bailey, the Children's Commissioner. Now, I know you can't speak for Mr Bailey, and I assume as a committee we probably will write to him, but can you tell me anything about the meeting, what sort of things were discussed, and if there was anything that he said that...
Generally speaking, the meeting was very cordial. Tam was a good listener, I have to say. He understood the situation, although he wouldn't commit himself at that point in time too directly to it. But my view and my gut feeling was that he was very sympathetic to what was going on. He did say to me in parting that he would expect that his involvement would remain on the sidelines until such times as the Parliament requested his view on it, and he would be more than willing to do so. His predecessor, can't remember her name, but she was concerned about the situation as well.
Well, as I say, I expect when we come on to decide what we're going to do, we will write to the Children's Commission if it was just to get an idea of what had been discussed at the meeting.
General discussion on the football side of things, an explanation from me as to why we were putting a petition forward, trying to give Tam an understanding of everything that was going on. But to be fair, he's a football man, so he had... Yeah, he was aware of some of the serious issues that we're bringing to the Parliament today.
I just want to just briefly touch on something Shona Brankin raised about the model. The SFA, Jim Fleeting, and those in there do go around Europe, and I went to a forum back in August last year. There are models out there. Inter Milan, they have 100 feeder clubs, so the kids stay locally. Holland, there's a restriction on how far you can go to sign a player in Holland. Barcelona was another example thrown up where, again, it's feeder clubs, and they have a sort of community spirit at Barcelona, unlike their big rivals Real Madrid, who are driven and buy big players. Barcelona's philosophy is to bring them up. I think one of the issues is, and it's one of the problems with the SFA, is that Jim or Neil McIntosh can go out there and do studies and reviews and bring back best practice, put it all up in a good presentation to the board. But the board is made up of club members who have a certain vested interest and think, well, that's great for Scottish football, but for my club, no, we're not releasing all our players. The Dutch FA KNVB are the board there are completely autonomous. None of them are connected to clubs, so to an extent they're looking after the welfare of their national game. In Scotland, we have, to use the phrase, we've given the lunatics the keys to the asylum, and there's too much vested interest in our game. Thanks.
Can I maybe, in a sense, that we're trying to map our way through this petition, and there's like 3 or 4 different elements to it. Clearly, in broader terms, I think the plea to all parliamentarians on the issue of investment in facilities and the whole issue of the use of education and curriculum more effectively, and that will be something that we all have to deal with through the discussions we're having in the Parliament. I think we're focused on what I think are 2 fundamental issues. One is the kind of process issues of what happens to a young man or woman involved in being signed up, because obviously there's an increasing participation of women in football, and obviously that will emerge into other professional opportunities for young women in Scotland as well as elsewhere. I think the second thing, though, is a concern is in terms of the football initiative itself, because I don't think any one of us has entered that with, because obviously I was a sports minister for a period. The concept was the idea that you would deal with the governing body, because that is autonomous, to try and put together a structure that clubs at all levels felt comfortable with. And what's happened in the intervening years, a number of very substantial grassroots clubs have felt it hasn't really connected in with the way in which they would see players developing. And if we're looking at models for development, because we've all got opinions on that, it's about how do we get the best things on that. Because I've heard Jim Fleeting, understandably, on a number of occasions speaking about trying to increase the numbers of participation, the individuals that can be identified, how we take that through. 2 things I found, though, in the period of time through that and in subsequent years, I think you've touched on at the very end point, clubs are, whether it's the Hibs or Hearts academies, or whether it was the Old Firm or A and others that have initiated these things, they are very, very protective of that individual player or that structure. So what would be helpful, it would be a sense of, you've given us 2 or 3 pointers there about other models to look at, but equally we've got this opportunity that may emerge, given the turbulence now in the SFA because of the loss of the Chief Executive. You've got the impending report from the former First Minister, which, according to the weekend reports, indicated some of the areas that you have expressed views on. I'm just wondering if we can maybe do something round maybe inviting the former First Minister to follow through on those issues at this committee once the report is published. So that's my observation, and all I know is that there's other people that have been in the government, either in the previous government or the present government, who know how frustrating it is to navigate the structures of the SFA, because none of us have got the right blazers on, and at least you're halfway there, Scott, today, But, there is a real concern there about who's talking on behalf of an organisation, and can they carry that organisation with them? And that strikes me as the real dilemma facing all of us as elected members here about where to start, because it is quite a defensive organisation when it comes to these debates. So sorry I took so long on that, but it struck me as that strikes me as where we need to focus the concentration of your petition so we can try and move things forward. So I'll finish on that and maybe invite Bill, and I know that Bill and I know that Trish are interested, so we'll try and pull together final points. Okay, Bill?
Well, I was just going to suggest that it seems to me that, having listened to all of the comments that the witnesses or the petitioners have made and members have made, this is an issue that is basically about the rights of young people versus the vested interests of private businesses. And what we really need to do is to progress the petition, which has a number of very important aspects to it in terms of facilities, education, the way in which young people are treated, the way in which the whole approach seems to be skewed not to the interests of the young people but to the interests of private businesses, the need to deliver coaching locally. All of these and other associated issues are things that I think the petitioners have quite rightly touched upon, and in supporting the petition I think we should ask certainly the Scottish Government if it will, and this is just for the Scottish Government, will it carry out the investigations asked for in the petition, especially with regard to audit. I also think we should be talking to the SFA, SFL, SPL, STUC, Scottish Commissioner for Children and Young People, asking what their views are on the petition and the issues that we've discussed at this initial meeting here in Parliament. And perhaps when we get that information back, we could think, or we could consider as a committee, inviting the former East Fife player and former First Minister, Henry McLeish, to come along and perhaps give his views to the committee. But I do think, I don't think anybody would gainsay this, we should be supporting unreservedly the very important and serious issues that have been raised in this petition.
Okay, I'll take members for the committee and then I'll bring people in. Okay, John and then Rona.
Welcome Bill Butler's suggestions. Could I also suggest that we actually write to, and I think based on Scott's comment earlier, the Dutch FA to find out, because I think this is to the heart of this petition is about how we take forward youth development in football in Scotland, whether that be for boys or girls in terms of Scottish football and the future of Scottish football. So I think we need to get an idea from the Dutch Football Association, based on Scott's comments, about how they progress the youth initiatives in Holland and elsewhere to take forward the football. But also, as I said in my earlier contribution, Convener, I think we need to write to a selection of local authorities, possibly Glasgow, Edinburgh, and one or two other smaller authorities, to find out two things. One is what impact there is on young people in education when they are being signed up at such a young age. And the second issue is whether or not those authorities are monitoring how those young people are actually being treated. Because William gave the example there of young people being asked on a Sunday to travel 200 miles there and 200 miles back to play a knockabout game of football somewhere in Scotland. And that does have an impact on the young people. And because if it was an employer wouldn't, in terms of, would be only allowed to employ that person for up to, I think it's 6 hours on a Sunday. Well, in relation to the children travelling those distances, then it takes up anything up to 12 hours for them to actually do that. So I think it might be worthwhile asking local authorities how they are monitoring how this is in operation and take it forward from their convener.
Rona?
Yeah, I would agree with all the suggestions that have been made. The only thing I would add would be that we should maybe get some advice from a lawyer specialising in children's law, children's rights.
Okay, I'll come back to members, and because I said I was going to cross over. Okay, thank you.
Very briefly, I was going to say what Bill did. I think it is important that we get some kind of audit trail from the government. It is, after all, public money. I had an interview with Tony Higgins of FIFA, and certainly the good practice that was out there would seem to suggest that if you weren't attending to your academic side in terms of school, you didn't get a game, you weren't allowed to play, so there was a kind of quid pro quo there. And that was something that certainly that I know happens in Holland and other places. So it had an impact on you. If it had an impact on your education, you weren't chosen to play. I'm just a wee bit concerned. I know what you're saying about work, but I would wonder that the way of getting around that is it's not actually work. You know, if you were saying about, I know that local authorities can give permission for certain things, but it's not. I'm just thinking of a way that they can get round it, because it's not actually work in terms of things. So the business of bringing in a lawyer that would know about children's law, and also the Commissioner for Children is, I think, a good one, because I suspect they can get around that.
If I get conscious of time, we've got other petitions that need to come for us. Others, Nigel, you want to come in? Yeah.